Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Dr. Gordon for helping me out with the paper. I know you're a busy guy. Actually, I've known for many years that Dr. Gordon's a busy guy because I remember way back at Mises University, one night I worked up the courage to ask him a question, and I said, Dr. Gordon, a clock has gears and springs inside that it uses to move its arms, and that's kind of like means and ends. So why don't we say that that's human action? And he thought about it for a minute, and he looked at me and said, that's a very good question, but I have to go. So I want to tell you about a fun little paper that I'm working on called Praxeology, Ethics, and Libertarianism. And the main result of this paper is a praxeological definition of aggression. So you can use praxeology to describe libertarianism, but you can't motivate libertarianism, as Dr. Gordon said, with praxeology. Before I delve into that, let me just tell you who I am. This is the first time I've spoken at this conference. My day job is building robotics and artificial intelligence systems, but my hobby is ethics research. So I've written a few papers for libertarian papers. Probably haven't seen any, but they're there if you want to check them out. And when I say I'm interested in ethics, I'm interested in a very particular kind of ethics, and that's deontological libertarianism. And that just means rule-following libertarianism, where you start with the non-aggression principle, and then you deduce all of your conclusions from that. So the better your definition of the non-aggression principle, the better your conclusions are. So from the NAP, you can derive that stealing's bad, murder's bad, fraud is bad, and then from there you figure out that, hey, the IRS is bad, war is bad, and Paul Krugman is bad. Okay, so let me motivate the paper by telling you about a little problem with current descriptions of aggression. You might start with something like, hey, aggression is violence. We don't want people to be violent to each other. But when you, most of the descriptions that people are currently using are just approximations to what we really mean by aggression. And I'll explain with some examples. So if you say aggression is violence, you are necessarily including or excluding behaviors that should be included as aggression or excluded. And so, for example, libertarians know that violence is okay if you use it in self-defense. So, for example, Karate Kid, right? You can modify the definition to take things that we know are not aggression out of the definition. So we could say, instead of aggression is violence, we could say aggression is the initiation of violence. So as long as you're not initiating it, you're okay. But this definition isn't good enough either because we know there are ways of engaging in aggression without actually initiating any violence. So for example, the mafia will just threaten people, and that's something that libertarians consider to be aggression and a crime. So we can go ahead and modify the definition again to try and bring those things into the definition that were excluded. So threat of violence, put that in there as well. But even this definition includes things that we all know are not aggression. For example, wrestling. So we can take the definition and modify it again and say, okay, non-consensual violence, non-consensual threat of violence. And we're getting closer to something that's like a rigorous definition, but we're still missing some things. For example, fraud. So once again, we can modify the definition and say, okay, aggression is the initiation of non-consensual violence and non-consensual threat of violence or fraud, but you really never solve the problem, and you can continue adding onto this list a list of crimes and then adding in exceptions to try and not include things that you know are not aggression. And this is kind of like an infinite series equation where every time you add a term, you get a little closer to the value you were trying to find. But the problem with ethics is every time you exclude a term, no matter how small it is, that's where someone comes in and says, hey, libertarianism doesn't work. Because if you look at this one small lifeboat scenario, or this one continuum problem, they can find a contradiction. So what we'd like to do is find some sort of closed form solution for what aggression really is, and then derive libertarianism from that. Kinsella and Tinsley state that the goal of this whole project with libertarianism is to find peaceful, conflict-free interaction between individuals. And to do that, how we're going to do that is to apply praxeology to our definitions. So the praxeological approach is pretty simple. We're just going to take two concepts and put them together. And one concept is a praxeological definition of conflict, which we'll develop in a minute. And the other is a result from Kinsella and Tinsley's paper, 2004 paper, Causation and Aggression. So I'll just go over those two things, We'll put them together, and then we'll have a praxeological definition for aggression. Okay, so to get the first part, the praxeological definition of conflict, we'll use a tool called binary classification, and I'm just going to review what that is really quick, because as we all know, Austrian economists don't know math. So you start with a set, it could be any set, and then you apply classification rules to break the set into different subsets. So if you took the set of all shapes, you could apply a classification rule of, does it have 3 straight sides? And that would break shapes into triangles and non-triangles. And then you can repeat this for the subsets to get, say, in the triangle set, does it have a 90-degree angle? And then you'd have right triangles and non-right triangles. So why do we do this? The reason is if you have a good definition for your initial set, and then your classification rules are well posed, you can use a definition for the original set and the classification rules to come up with a rigorous definition for any of the subsets. So if you ask me what are right triangles, I can say, well, they're shapes that have 3 straight sides and have a 90-degree angle. Great. So we're going to do the same thing to try and find the praxeological definition of conflict, but we're going to start with the set of human action. And human action, I hope you'll agree, is a pretty well-posed set. And the first classification rule we're going to use is when you look at a particular element, one action, is it relevant to other actions? If it is, you can call that interaction. If it's not, you can call it action in isolation. So action in isolation is just you on a deserted island. Interaction is what most of us do every day. And then we'll apply another classification rule to interaction. And that rule is it compatible with other actions? And that will break interaction into compatible interactions and incompatible interactions. So for example, if you fall over and you're trying to get back up, and I help you get back up, those are that's an interaction, 2 actions, and they're compatible because the means are compatible and the ends are compatible. But if you're trying to get up and I just push you back down, that's an incompatible set of actions. And I would like to define conflict as any subset of mutually exclusive actions in this incompatible class. So for example, me pushing someone who's trying to get up, down, those are 2 actions that would be in the incompatible set, and I would say that's a conflict. And this definition of a conflict doesn't tell you a whole lot, because we're trying not to talk about the details of what's going on in action. We're just trying to find an abstract idea of what conflict is. So I'd just like to emphasize the distinction between compatible and incompatible action with some examples. So for example, a soccer match, you have 2 teams that have incompatible ends. They both want to win the soccer match, but their actions are actually compatible. In fact, they can't even play the game unless they cooperate and all follow the rules. And it's sort of like dancing. You work together to accomplish some end. But with the soccer match, even if their ends are incompatible, the means can be compatible. And thus the actions are as well. Another example is competition in the free market. So you might have 2 store owners on opposite sides of a street selling the same product to the same customer. And they both can't succeed. Only one of them is going to be able to sell. But even if one of them's shouting, waving signs and trying to make a sale, that doesn't prevent the other one from trying to sell his products. So they're both able to engage in their own chosen behavior, even if only one of them will be able to succeed. So this definition of conflict is important for the non-aggression principle because, as I argue in the paper, liberty it can be thought of as freedom from constraint by others, and conflict is actually whenever someone is being constrained by someone else. So this idea that conflict is actually the opposite of liberty. So liberty is when you're not involved in conflict, and all of your human interaction is in that compatible bucket that we talked about before. So once we have a praxeological idea of the bad thing, the conflict that we're trying to avoid, the next step is to determine who the bad guy is. And Kinsella and Tinsley have already done this in their 2004 paper, and they've developed a praxeological way to assign responsibility for a conflict. And what was their answer for how to do that? They basically said just use praxeology. Instead of trying to come up with rules that are based on physics or something concrete in the world, use the abstract concept of action. So what they say is don't rely solely on physical acts. Consider the human action involved and use understanding to determine causality. So for example, if the president of some non-US country orders his general to order some soldier to shoot some civilian, we don't necessarily know from the physical acts that the soldier shooting the civilian is a crime that the higher-ups are responsible for. But by understanding human action, we know that the chain of events was caused by the initial orders coming from the non-US president. So Kinsella and Tinsley say that the general question facing libertarians then is whether a particular actor by his action intentionally caused the prohibited result. So when you're trying to find an aggressor, what you're really looking for is anyone who is ultimately responsible for a conflict happening, not necessarily people directly involved in any sort of violence or fighting. And the example that they use is if a terrorist mails a bomb in a package, the mailman who delivers the bomb and ends up killing somebody, even though they're temporarily related to the person and spatially related, they're not ultimately responsible for the crime that was committed. It was the terrorist who used the mailman as a means. So then, with these two praxeological concepts, the non-aggression principle becomes pretty simple. It is just don't cause conflict. And it doesn't tell you anything about specific acts that are aggression or things that are crimes, but it tells you the general rule that can then be used to do derivations to find more specific results. So in summary, the paper is about using praxeology to define conflict, identify aggressors using the method from Kinsella and Tinsley, and then define libertarianism. So I think we're skipping questions to the end, so thank you very much.